The silence of Naples carried the weight of a confession. The city seemed suspended in its own secrets, and Marco Santini walked among them as if he were part of the shadows. They said he was the most feared man in southern Italy, the ghost of Naples. A man without a past, without hesitation, and without compassion. His presence was like the wind, felt but not seen. That night, the asphalt reflected the harbor lights like a stained mirror. Marco walked slowly, his hands tucked into his black coat, his gaze hard. A lit cigarette clutched between his fingers, and a thought that had no name. When he opened the car door and got in, the driver regarded him in the mirror with the same reverence a man might regard a loaded gun. "It's done," said the driver. "It always is," Marco replied coldly. The car drove through the streets to the mansion of Don Vittorio Ricci, the supreme leader of the organization. The iron gate opened with ceremonial slowness. Inside, the smell of cigars and expensive wine announced power. Vittorio was waiting for him, seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by armed men and women too beautiful to be there of their own free will. "Marco," the Don said, standing up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "you always arrive early." "Mission complete," replied the man, handing over an envelope. Vittorio observed him for a few seconds, as if trying to read beyond his face. "You're one of the few who still remind me that efficiency is an art. Sit down. We have a new task." Marco stood up. "What's the target?" The Don opened a folder and pushed it across the table. A photograph slid toward him. It was a woman's face. Young, with intense brown eyes and a firm expression. "Giulia Moretti, journalist. You've been digging too much where you shouldn't. You've already written about our smaller roots. If you keep going, you'll get to the source." Marco stared at the photo for several long seconds, not out of desire, but out of curiosity. There was something in that gaze that disarmed him. "Do you want me to make it disappear?" "As always." Vittorio poured himself some wine. "Quick and clean." Marco nodded and left. In the car, he glanced at the photo one more time before putting it in his pocket. The rain was beginning to fall, and he thought that perhaps fate had a sense of humor, sending a man dead inside to eliminate a woman all too alive. The next day, he parked his motorcycle in front of Piazza del Gesù. The shy sun illuminated the hustle and bustle of tourists and boys playing violins. Elena was there, taking pictures of a child, bending down to her level. Marco watched from a distance, leaning against a scooter that wasn't his. She smiled at the boy, dropped some coins into the box, and jotted something down in a worn notebook. He noticed her care, her simple manner, and for the first time in years, he felt something that wasn't anger or fear. Curiosity. "Does she do this to everyone?" asked Luca, the new boy assigned to help him. Marco didn't answer. He continued looking. When Elena turned and looked at him, time seemed to slow. Her gaze met his, and neither of them looked away. There was something recognizable there, as if they saw in the other what they tried to hide from themselves. Luca grumbled. "She saw you. Let's see. Don Vittorio wants it quick." "Vittorio wants what I let him want," Marco said, with a calmness that chilled the boy. Hours later, he followed Elena to an old neighborhood. He watched her enter an old building and waited until nightfall. When the lights went out, he climbed the stairs and opened the door with a trick he had learned as a young man. The apartment smelled of coffee and paper. The walls were covered with photographs. On the table were stacks of notes, clippings, and a blue notebook. Mark opened it. The first pages spoke of a murdered brother, Giulia Moretti, killed in one of the Mafia's operations. The words were simple, but charged with honest pain. He turned a few more pages and found names he recognized: businessmen, police officers, roots. And in the midst of it all, phrases that disarmed him. "If I stop, the world will forget." Marco closed the notebook, without knowing why. For the first time, he hesitated, the sound of the lock making him freeze. Elena had returned. He hid in the hallway, his heart pounding. He heard the jingle of keys, Footsteps, the sound of the kettle. She stopped in front of the table and frowned. "Strange," he murmured. "I swear I left it open on another page." Marco held his breath. Her curiosity almost exposed him, but she simply closed her notebook and went to the bathroom. He left like a ghost, closing the door silently. Outside, he lit a cigarette, his hand trembling. He had read hundreds of cold reports, but nothing had ever struck him like these pages. The next morning, he was in the square again. When Elena appeared, he approached, for the first time without a plan. "Luca," he said, making up the name. "Photographer." She recognized him from the day before and laughed. "Photographer? Doesn't look like it." "And what does a photographer look like?" "Less dangerous." "It's the danger that makes the photo good." She smiled, and the world seemed to lose weight for a moment. They spent the morning together. She took photos, he observed. They talked about art, about fear, about streets no one else looked at. Marco said little, but she seemed to hear even his silence. At the end of the day, she invited him for coffee. At the small table at Café d'Oriente, he heard her voice speak about justice, about her brother, about her dream of showing that goodness still existed amidst the chaos. "Sometimes I feel like the world is a lie," she said, "but I keep writing, because it's the only way to avoid becoming an accomplice." "Words are more dangerous than weapons," he said. "So we're on the same side, Luca." He hesitated. "I don't know yet." Over the next few days, they began seeing each other. First for work, then for no apparent reason. Elena made him laugh, something he'd thought impossible. And every smile of hers was a crack in the shield he'd spent his life building. One night, after an interview at a shelter, she invited him to dinner. She cooked poorly, laughed about it, and he thought it was the most beautiful laugh he'd ever heard. They talked until late. She told him about Giulio, about death, about guilt. He almost told her what he had done, but he kept quiet. As she reached out to pour more wine, the light touch of her hands made time stand still. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked. "Because I want to remember what it's like to look without having to shoot later." She laughed, not fully understanding. He laughed too, not knowing if he deserved it. That night when he left the apartment, the air felt different. The man who felt nothing began to feel too much. And deep down, Marco Santini knew. The mission had already failed. But he didn't care. The next dawn broke heavy, humid, with the kind of lingering heat that portends tragedy. Marco woke before the sun. Still in bed, he answered the phone without saying his own name. "She's scheduled," the voice on the other end said bluntly. "The Don wants it today." It's over. No conversation, no elegance. A sentence, not an order. Marco hung up without answering. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. His body felt heavy, but it wasn't physical exhaustion. It was moral weight, something he thought no longer lived within him. Today would be the day he killed the woman who taught him to feel again, or the day he turned against everything that had kept him alive until now. Around 9 in the morning, Elena was in a narrow, dangerous neighborhood in Naples' old town, taking photos of graffiti on walls denouncing politicians and drug traffickers. Completely unprotected. She had no idea she was living on loan. Marco watched from afar on his motorcycle. He saw the black car pull up on the corner. 2 men. He knew them both. They weren't just any men. They were the ones Vittorio sent when nothing could go wrong. He didn't think, just reacted. She abandoned the motorcycle, skidding on the wet cobblestones, and entered the alley the same second the first shooter drew his gun. A shot shattered a window. Elena screamed, reflexively ducking, uncomprehending. Marco knocked the first man down with a punch so fast it seemed choreographed. The second man emerged from the car, already firing. Bullets slammed into the walls like metal against stone, ricocheting. "Run!" he shouted, pulling Elena by the arm. "What's happening? Who are you?" She was trembling. "Later, come on." They ran through narrow alleys, hearing gunshots behind them and shouts of, "Get her!" They descended ancient stairs carved into the stone. The smell of fish and garbage mingled with the smell of gunpowder. Elena stumbled, nearly falling. Marco grabbed her waist and pulled her back. They reached an alley that led to the port. There were small boats tied up, nets, and plastic crates. Marco pushed her behind a container and pulled out his gun. 2 shots. Silence. She was crying nervously, but holding it in with her teeth. He noticed it too. "Are you okay?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the street. She swallowed. "You're one of them, aren't you?" He didn't answer. "You came to kill me," she said, her voice trembling and her eyes welling up. "And now you're saving me. This doesn't make sense." "Don't do it for yourself," he said, finally looking at her. "But do it for me. Who sent these guys?" Silence. "It was the same man who sent you." Marco took a deep breath. "Yes." She closed her eyes, and a heavy tear fell. "Then I was right. They are desperate. You are afraid of what I have." "It's not you, Elena." "Don't call me by my name," she spat angrily. Marco tried to answer, but he staggered. His shoulder was bleeding. Only now did she realize. The blood was running down his arm, hot. Her eyes widened. "You were hit." "It's nothing." "Shut up, it is." She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "Sit down." He tried to protest. She ignored him. She ripped open her own shirt and pressed the fabric against the wound. Her hands trembled, but she kept the pressure. He saw it, and something absurd happened. He wanted to cry. Not from physical pain. From something else. From care. Something he no longer knew how to accept. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because if you die now, I'll never find out why the hell you saved me," he replied angrily. He chuckled softly, despite the pain. "You're crazy." "No," she said, her eyes burning. "I'm terrified." She took a deep breath, looking at him closely, very closely. "Who are you?" He hesitated. The name he used with her was already too fragile. "My name is Marco," he said finally. She closed her eyes as if she had been slapped. "Marco Santini." "Yes." She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "I know your name. I know." "You're a murderer," she said, as if confessing a bitter truth. "I was," he replied without running away. "Now I'm just a problem." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "You followed me, lied, broke into my house, read my diary, and now you expect me to trust you?" "I don't want you to trust," he said. "I want you to live." She froze. It hit a spot she wasn't ready to touch. "You're going to have to leave Naples. Now," he said firmly. "They know who you are. They know where you live. They know who you met. And they know you're ready to publish." "Have I published it yet?" "Not yet," he replied. "But they'll make you disappear before you publish it." She looked at him, her eyes shining. "And you? What happens if I live?" He didn't dodge. "I'll die." They were silent for a while, breathing, listening to the distant sound of sirens and the waves crashing against the harbor pillars. She held the fabric on his shoulder. He held her wrist gently, as if afraid she would disappear if he let go. "If I go with you," she began, "will they stop?" "No," he replied, "but I'll hold it." She smiled sadly. "You speak as if your life were disposable." Yes, that's how she understood that the choice had already been made for him. For the next few hours, they drove toward the Amalfi coast. The winding road hugged cliffs and revealed a seemingly endless sea. Helena looked out the window at the landscape, but she didn't see beauty. She saw loss. She saw a point of no return. They arrived at a small, old, hidden house. A house that wasn't in anyone's name. The walls smelled of lemon and damp wood, the kind of place that seems to exist outside of time. He turned on the lights, tossed the keys on the table, and said simply, "We're safe here. For a while. For a while." 2 words that were more tender than any explicit statement. She walked through the house as if touching a memory that wasn't hers. She ran her fingers along the edges of the table, opened a window, and breathed in the salty scent of the sea. He watched her silently, as if observing were a privilege. "Sit down," she said without asking. "I'm going to clean that wound." He grimaced. "You're so bossy." "I do," he replied. "And you obey." He, the most feared man in Naples, sat down. Elena cleaned the cut on his shoulder with warm water and antiseptic. Her touch was gentle, almost tender. He let himself be cared for like someone who no longer knew how things worked. "Have you always been like this?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "Cold, distant, dangerous?" "No," he replied. "I learned." "And who taught you?" He was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "The world." She bit her lip. "That's not an answer." "No." He looked at her. "But that's all I can say today." That night they ate something simple: pasta, garlic, tomatoes. They cooked together. He chopped, she stirred the pot. They laughed at small things. They laughed at the completely disastrous way he broke the pasta into pieces before adding it to the water. He pretended it was intentional. She called it a cultural crime. For the first time in a long time, they actually laughed. It was an absurd piece, almost indecent compared to the outside world, and that was exactly why it hurt so much. Later, the 2 of them sat on the balcony watching the sea. Elena sat with her knees drawn up, her head resting on her arms. Marco leaned against the wall, smoking, but unhurriedly. "You know I'm a journalist," she said, looking into the darkness. "My job is to tell the truth." "I know." "Then give me yours." He took a while to answer. He almost didn't answer. But then he said, "I grew up in a place where no one survived without selling something. Some sold their bodies. Some sold their names. I sold my hand. Vittorio gave me a place, and he charged a high price for it." She closed her eyes. "How many did you kill?" He took a deep breath. "Enough to forget the first face." "What now? Would you still do it?" He turned to face her. "For you, I would do anything." Elena felt a shiver run through her body. It wasn't fear. It wasn't exactly comfort. It was something else. The feeling of being loved by a man too dangerous to even utter the word love. "Marco," she began softly, "why did you save me?" He stared at the cigarette as if the answer lay there, and then he said simply, raw, all too true, "Because you reminded me that I'm still human." She closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. She held back tears she hadn't intended to hold back. "That's crazy," she said, trying to laugh. "You know that, right?" "Yes," he replied, "but it's ours." They were silent for a few minutes. The sea pounded below, steady, the kind of sound that seems to lull confessions. "I'm afraid of you," she said finally. He swallowed hard. "I know. But I'm more afraid than I feel for you," he concluded. He stared at her. She held his gaze. And for the first time, they weren't hunter and target. They weren't criminal and witness. They weren't mission and risk. It was just them. He touched her face with the backs of his fingers, slowly, as if asking permission. She closed her eyes and rested her face against his hand. The world suddenly felt very small. The kiss came later. It wasn't quick, it wasn't urgent, it was inevitable. When their lips touched, there was no turning back. He tasted salt, wine, and truth. She felt her heart explode against her chest and knew she was lost. As they pulled away, she kept her forehead pressed against his. "What now?" he whispered. "Now?" he repeated, his whisper laced with pain and desire. "Now we survive until tomorrow." They slept in the same bed that night, not like 2 bodies clinging to each other out of animal need. but like two people genuinely afraid to close their eyes and wake up without each other there. She slept with her head on his chest. He slept with his hand on her back. Neither of them dreamed. It was as if, for a few hours, the world had decided to forgive. But the world doesn't forgive anyone for long. Before dawn, Marco heard what he'd been accustomed to hearing since he was young. Engines, distant but getting closer. The sound of more than one car coming up the road to the house. They were heavy. They weren't tourists. They weren't fishermen. He woke up immediately. "Elena," he whispered, touching her shoulder. "Wake up. Get up, now." She sat up, startled. "What? What is it?" "They found us." Her eyes darkened. "Vittorio." He had them both killed this time. She hurriedly put on her clothes, her body trembling. He grabbed his weapons. His face changed. The tenderness disappeared, giving way to the man the world feared. But now something was different. It wasn't just survival instinct. It was protection. "Listen to me," he said quickly, cupping her face. "They can't take you alive. Understand? They can't lay their hands on you. Marco, promise. Marco, promise. I promise," she whispered, crying. The front door exploded seconds later. Gunmen burst in, shooting. The noise was deafening. Wood and glass flying. The smell of gunpowder filling the air. Marco fired back with cold precision, taking out 2 men in the first second. Elena ducked behind the table, her hands covering her ears, her heart pounding as if it were about to leap out of her chest. "Come," he shouted, pulling her by the hand. They ran down the hallway as gunfire exploded around the walls. Elena grabbed a gun as he'd taught her and fired instinctively when a man appeared in the kitchen. Her shot hit. The man fell. She froze in shock. I, he stammered. "I killed him?" "You lived," Marco said, pulling her back. "Look at me. You lived." They left through the back door, descending to the trail that led to the cliff. The rain was beginning to fall, a fine mist mixing smoke and salt. Below, the sea crashed heavily against the rocks. "We can't stay," she said, her breath broken. "We're not staying," he replied firmly. "From now on, we're running." She turned her face away. "From now on, we exist?" He almost smiled. Almost. They got in their car and disappeared down the road before Vittorio's men could close in. They left behind shrapnel, blood, and a house that wasn't home. Just a moment too short. Driving, he spoke little but thought a lot. He knew this wasn't going to stop. There was no returning to normal. They had crossed the line. The organization wouldn't sleep until they were dead. Elena was no longer just a bothersome journalist. She was a direct and personal threat. And him? He was no longer just an obedient soldier. He was now a traitor. In Naples, Vittorio was furious. The entire organization was shaking. Politicians, ports, shipping, money laundering. Everything would be at risk if she published the evidence she had. And he knew Elena had it all. More than that, she knew Marco was on her side. That's when Vittorio did what no boss wants to do because it always ends in bloodshed. He pronounced his best man's sentence aloud. From now on, Marco Santini is a dead man. It was 3 days of escape, 3 days of sleeping in different places, always on the move, always afraid. The two began communicating with looks, not words. A gesture from him was enough for her to know it was time to duck. The way she held his arm was enough for him to know she was at her limit. On the 4th day, Elena made a decision that was also suicidal. She returned to Naples. "You've lost your mind," he said furiously. "I'll hand over the proofs," she said. "I'll send everything to my editor. I didn't run away all this time and then live in hiding until I die. I'm not you." That hurt him, more than any gunshot he'd ever taken. "The world doesn't change just because you want it to," he said. "No," she replied, "but it changes when someone chooses to stop being afraid." He closed his eyes. It was as if he could hear her brother Giulio speaking through her mouth. "You're going to die," he said. "I'm already dead," she replied simply. She got out of the car and crossed the street with the brown briefcase on her chest, protecting it as if it were a spare heart. He followed at a distance, just watching. Ready to kill or be killed, whichever came first. And then it all came crashing down. 2 black cars rounded the corner. Vittorio's men jumped out, armed, and the world slowed to a crawl. Marco grabbed Elena, and they ran. Gunshots shattered storefront windows, sirens wailed in the distance, and someone screamed. They entered an old building, climbed 2 flights of stairs, walked through a damp hallway, and emerged onto the rooftop. It was raining. The wind was strong. "Now is the time for you to choose," he said. She looked at him breathlessly. "Choose what?" "Whether you're going to live on the run with me or die fighting alone." She held his face with both hands, crying, but firm. "And you? What do you choose?" He took a deep breath. "I've already chosen." And then he did the one thing he'd never done for anyone in his entire life. He put her life above his own. Marco faced Vittorio's men alone on the terrace, using his own body as a shield, firing as he yelled for her to run. One bullet hit his abdomen. Another grazed him. He staggered but didn't fall. He held on tight. He protected her. He bought seconds. That was all she needed. "Go away," he shouted, bleeding. "Publish this shit. Show the world who they are." She was in tears, drenched in rain and despair. "I can't leave you." "You already saved me," he said, and smiled painfully. "Now go." She kissed him. And in that kiss was everything: anger, love, gratitude, goodbye, and a promise neither of them knew if they could keep. Elena ran downstairs. Marco stayed. Not out of handsome heroism. Out of resolve. He knew that was the price. And he was paying it gladly. When the men reached the ladder, he was still standing. And in that moment, Marco Santini, the most feared man in Naples, stopped being the ghost of the Mafia and became something else. He became living proof that even a monster can choose who to protect. He fell minutes later, but there was no fear on his face, only peace. The rain fell mercilessly on Naples. The sea roared, the city slept, unaware that an empire was about to crumble. Elena ran through the narrow streets, her brown briefcase clutched tightly to her chest. At every corner, footsteps echoed behind her. Her heart beat faster than the sound of distant sirens. She was alive by a miracle or by love, and that miracle had a name: Marco Santini. He arrived at the harbor just before dawn. The water was pounding against the rocks, and the wind was whipping his hair into his face. He found a small, nearly abandoned boat. He climbed in, started the engine, and the noise seemed to rip through the night. Behind her, 2 black cars, men getting out, gunshots, the sound of bullets echoing off the metal. She bent down and sped up the boat. The waves crashed hard, tossing her from side to side. Her hands ached from gripping the helm. She cried without realizing it. The city's reflection faded on the horizon. The rain washed away the blood, the fear, and any trace of what had come before. Hours later, she docked the boat in a secluded cove. Her legs trembled as she stepped onto the sand. She was exhausted. He found an old fishing hut and took shelter there. He lit a lamp, opened the briefcase, and spread the documents out on the table. The pages were wet, some stained, but legible. They contained trafficking routes, accounts in tax havens, the names of judges and senators. It was more than proof. It was a collective confession from a sick country. He picked up the phone and called Lorenzo, the editor. "I have everything," he said hoarsely. "The evidence, the names, the routes. If I don't show up by tomorrow, publish everything." "Where are you?" he asked. "In a place where the sea is higher than fear." She hung up before he could insist. He sat on the floor, hugged his legs, and cried until he fell asleep. He woke up to the sound of a gunshot. A shard of wood flew over her head. They had arrived. Armed men climbing the cabin stairs. Elena ran, grabbed the gun Marco had left, and took a deep breath. The first man came in shooting. She reacted. The shot hit his shoulder. Another came right after. She stumbled, fell, and rolled into the corner. The barrel of one of their guns touched her forehead. The man smiled. Vittorio sends his regards. Before he could pull the trigger, a dry shot echoed behind him. The body fell. Behind, soaked, wounded, with a pale face, was Marco. She couldn't believe it. "You," she whispered, trembling. "I thought you were dead." "Almost," he replied, leaning against the wall. "Hell threw me out." She ran to him and hugged him. His body was trembling. "You shouldn't be here. And you should have left." But there was no time. More shots. Marco pulled Elena by the hand. The two of them left through the back. They ran across the sand, the sound of bullets behind them. The rain returned, cold, merciless. They stopped near the rocks. The sea before them was a monster. "If we stay, we die," she said. "If we run away, they'll kill everyone else," he said. "So what do we do?" "Finish what you started." Marco opened his coat and showed a grenade. "Marco," she whispered. "Go away. Now. I won't leave you. You promised to live. Keep it." She cried, her face pressed against his. "I love you." He smiled weakly. It was worth it. She kissed him one last time and ran. Marco waited until he saw the men approaching. He looked at the sea, took a deep breath, and said, "May this be of some use." The sound of the explosion engulfed everything. Hours later, the wind carried the smell of smoke across the coast. Elena walked down the road covered in mud, her diary tucked under her arm. "Didn't look back. I couldn't." Days later, the name Elena Moretti was in the headlines. The evidence has been published. The Ricci empire began to crumble. Politicians fell, judges disappeared, fortunes were frozen. But Don Vittorio was still breathing. From the balcony of his mansion, he watched the news with a hateful smile. "She won," said a henchman. "Not yet," Vittorio replied. "As long as I'm alive, she hasn't won." He grabbed his coat, his gun, and left. That night, the devil went hunting alone. Elena hid in an abandoned convent in Salerno. Her name was Lucia now. She helped the nuns care for orphans, wrote letters she never sent. Sometimes she dreamed of him. She woke up startled, swearing she heard his voice saying, "Live." One night, a car's headlights cut through the darkness. She looked out the window. The heart raced. A shadow crossed the courtyard. He knocked on the door. "Elena." She recognized the voice and the world stopped. It opened slowly. Marco was there. Pale, tired, with a scar on his face, but alive. "I dreamed about you," she said, crying. "I came back," he replied, "not to escape, to end this." They didn't have time for long hugs. The sound of engines echoed outside. Vittorio had arrived. The monastery became a battlefield. Men invaded the corridors. Marco and Elena fought side by side. Each shot a reminder of everything they had lost. The smell of gunpowder mingled with the ancient incense. And in the end, it was just the two of them, and dawn left. Vittorio pointed the gun. "I made you, Marco. And now I undo you," he replied. The shot echoed. Vittorio fell. The sound of rain started again. Marco staggered, bleeding. Elena ran to him and held him in her arms. "It's over," she said, crying. "Nothing ends," he murmured. "It just changes places." She took his hand. "Let's go." He looked at her and smiled. "I've stayed too long." His eyes slowly closed, and the most feared man in the world finally rested. Days later, Elena buried Marco in silence. No name, no cross, just the sound of the sea. On the grave, he left the blue notebook. Inside it was a letter he had written. "I spent my life believing that killing was surviving, but you taught me that living is feeling, even when it hurts. If someone ever asks who I was, just say, 'A man who tried.'" She kept the paper and cried until she had no more tears. Then he left, He threw the diary into the sea, and the sea swallowed him as if returning a secret to silence. Months later in Rome, Elena presented a documentary. The title, "The Mission That Destroyed the Most Feared Man in the World." He spoke for a few minutes. He simply said, "The truth does not change the past, but it prevents fear from writing the future." Applause, lights, silence. That night at the hotel, she lit a candle and placed it in the window. The wind blew. The flame danced. She smiled. "Good evening, Marco." 5 years have passed. Elena lived in Tuscany among vineyards and tranquility. He wrote little, spoke less. He kept a black and white photo on the table. Marco, in profile, sitting by the sea. A village boy knocked on his door and handed him a letter. It said, "It appeared on the monastery altar." Elena opened it. The handwriting was firm and familiar. "If you ever read this, it will be because the sea has fulfilled its promise. The waves always return what we deserve to find again. I deserved to meet you once, and that was enough." She pressed the paper to her chest and smiled through her tears. Outside, the wind picked up. The candle flickered. And for an instant, she swore she heard his voice, serene, in the breath of the wind. Live. The sun set, and peace finally arrived.